I never thought I would be stranded in another country with no access to my own money, but that is exactly what happened when my bank froze my account without warning. It began like any normal trip. I had been planning for months to visit Spain, a long-awaited break from the grind of my work schedule back home. I landed in Madrid with excitement buzzing in my chest. The air smelled of roasted coffee and stone streets that had carried centuries of footsteps stretched before me. For the first 2 days, everything went smoothly. I toured museums, sampled tapas in crowded bars, and even took a train to Toledo, where the medieval walls rose high against the summer sky. Then, on the third morning, the trap closed. I was at a small cafe near the Plaza Mayor, ordering breakfast before catching a train to Seville. I slid my card across the counter with a smile, expecting the usual beep of approval. Instead, the cashier frowned and shook his head. The machine displayed a message I had never seen before. Transaction declined. Try again. I swiped again, confident it was some minor error. Declined again. The line of locals behind me grew impatient. Embarrassed, I fumbled for cash, but realized I had very little left in my wallet. I called the number on the back of my card while still standing in the cafe. A robotic voice told me my account had been frozen due to suspicious activity and I would need to contact my bank immediately. My stomach dropped. I pressed 0 until I reached a live agent. After 30 minutes of being transferred between departments, I finally spoke to someone who explained coldly that my recent charges in Spain had triggered a fraud alert. I told them of course they did. I was traveling. I'd even informed the bank before leaving. The agent replied that the note on my account had not been recorded properly. The only solution, she said, was to verify my identity in person at a branch back home. I laughed bitterly into the phone. I was 6,000 miles away. I asked if they could email me documents, if I could fax paperwork, anything at all. She repeated the same phrase like a machine. You will need to visit a branch in person. I hung up, trembling. My hotel bill was due that night. I had tours booked and trains reserved. Without access to my money, everything unraveled quickly. By the evening, the hotel clerk informed me, politely but firmly, that without payment, my room could not be extended. I tried explaining that my bank had frozen me out, but he only shrugged. Policy is policy. I spent that night in the train station, my suitcase for a pillow, listening to announcements echo in Spanish and English while my phone battery dwindled. The next day, hunger gnawed at me. I pawned a pair of headphones I had brought for the flight just to buy food. I borrowed 20 euros from a kind older couple who saw me struggling with a ticket machine. The humiliation burned worse than the hunger. Every time I checked my phone, new messages from the bank filled the screen. Automated alerts of declined charges, warnings that unpaid bills back home were accumulating late fees. The cruel irony was that I had more than enough money to cover every expense, but it was locked behind a screen I could not break. By the 4th day, I managed to get a Western Union transfer from a friend back home. The clerk handed me the cash with sympathetic eyes, but the small sum was barely enough to cover a cheap flight back to the United States. My dream trip ended in a blur of airports and exhaustion. When the plane lifted off, I pressed my forehead against the window and swore that I would make the bank answer for this. Back home, I walked into my branch the very next morning, unshaven and weary, still dragging the same suitcase I had carried through Spanish train stations. The smug look on the manager's face when she told me they had been following procedure only deepened my anger. She tapped her nails on the desk and told me the freeze was unavoidable, that I should be grateful they had protected me from fraudulent charges. I told her what it had cost me, the lost trip, the humiliation, the nights without shelter. She shrugged. Some inconvenience is to be expected, she said. My account remained frozen while she claimed to be verifying documents. In the meantime, bills from home had bounced, automatic payments had failed, fees had stacked like bricks against me. That morning, I understood clearly that this was not a mistake, not a simple computer glitch. This was a system designed to keep me powerless while they hid behind policy. And if they thought I was going to accept it quietly, they were about to learn they had chosen the wrong person to freeze.
I returned from Spain with nothing but frustration and the bitter taste of betrayal clinging to me. My body was back home, but my mind was still stuck in that Madrid cafe where my card first failed. The first thing I did after dropping my suitcase at the door was drive straight to my bank branch. I wanted answers. The lobby was nearly empty when I walked in, but behind the counter, I spotted her immediately. The branch manager, a woman named Karen White, with hair sprayed so stiff it looked carved from stone, and an expression that radiated superiority. She greeted me with the kind of smile that is not a smile at all, the kind that says she knows she holds power over you. I told her I had just returned from abroad after being stranded because the bank froze my account. She nodded with fake sympathy and said she understood my frustration. I pushed the point harder, explaining the nights I spent without food or a place to stay. Her response was ice cold. The bank follows protocol for suspicious activity. We cannot be held responsible for personal inconvenience. Those words stung more than I expected. I was not asking for pity. I was asking for access to my own money I had earned through years of work. She told me my account would remain locked for review until further notice, and that I would need to submit documents to prove my identity. I reminded her that she had just checked my driver's license, my passport, even asked me to verify my address and phone number. She shrugged and said the process could not be rushed. What she failed to mention, but what I later discovered, was that while my account sat frozen, the bank had begun quietly stacking fees. Every auto-pay bill I had set up was bouncing. My credit card was charging late penalties. My mortgage payment was marked delinquent. All of it spiraled into a financial mess in just a matter of weeks. I went home that night and opened my email to a flood of notices. Your payment has failed. Your account is past due. A utility company threatening to cut service. Even my health insurance premium had bounced. The safety net I thought I had carefully built was collapsing, all because one manager decided my account needed to be reviewed. I spent hours on the phone with customer service, repeating the same explanations, begging them to unlock my account. Each call ended with the same rehearsed line. "We understand your frustration, sir, but you will need to wait for the investigation to be completed." The word investigation made me feel like I was the criminal. I had done nothing wrong, but suddenly I was treated as though I was trying to steal from my own account. My family began to feel the impact too. My younger sister called me one night in tears because the joint savings account we used to pay for our mother's care had been tied up in the freeze as well. Mom's prescriptions were delayed because payments failed. That was the moment my frustration turned into pure rage. This was no longer about a ruined vacation or late fees. This was about the people I loved being hurt because of the arrogance of a bank that thought it could play God with my money. I returned to the branch a second time and demanded a meeting with Karen. She sat across from me with her arms crossed, her office smelling faintly of expensive perfume. She explained that discrepancies had been found in my account history. When I pressed her to explain, she waved vaguely at the papers in front of her. "Certain transactions appear inconsistent," she said. I leaned forward and told her firmly that every single transaction was mine, documented, and legal. She gave me a smile so smug it made my stomach churn. "If that is the case, then you have nothing to worry about," she said. "The review will confirm everything. Until then, your account will remain locked." I asked her how long that would take. She said weeks, maybe months. I nearly shouted her across the desk, "You are holding my life hostage." She only raised an eyebrow and told me calmly that I should be careful with my tone. I left her office shaking with anger. At home, I tore through every folder and drawer where I kept financial records. Bank statements, receipts, tax documents, all spread across my kitchen table. Something in my gut told me this was not incompetence, this was deliberate. But deliberate for what reason I could not yet see. Days turned into weeks. My phone calls and complaints went nowhere. Each day, more penalties stacked up. Debt collectors began to call. And through it all, the bank maintained its icy silence. The tipping point came when I received a letter stating that my account had been flagged for suspicious deposits tied to fraud. Fraud. The word burned in my mind. They were not only freezing my account, they were painting me as a criminal to cover their tracks. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by papers and unpaid bills, and swore that I would not let them win. If they thought they could bury me under their policies and procedures, they were about to learn that I was willing to dig much deeper than they ever imagined.
I realized the only way to fight back was to start digging into the very records the bank thought I would never touch. I began with my own files, the stack of bank statements I had saved for years. I spread them across the floor like puzzle pieces, tracing deposits and withdrawals with a highlighter. At first, everything looked normal, but after a few hours, I noticed small discrepancies. Charges I did not recognize, fees that appeared under different names but repeated each month in nearly identical amounts. Some were only a few dollars, but over years they added up to hundreds. It struck me that this was no simple freeze for security. This was a pattern of siphoning money disguised as routine fees. I called the bank to ask about them, but the representative on the phone acted confused. She said those fees were standard service charges and quickly tried to end the call. When I pressed harder, she grew defensive and said if I had concerns, I should speak to my branch manager. I hung up shaking. I knew Karen White would stonewall me again, but I also knew there had to be a way around her. The next morning, I visited the branch, pretending to be calm. Instead of approaching Karen, I waited until a younger teller finished with a customer. I asked him quietly if he had ever noticed unusual charges in customer accounts. He hesitated and glanced nervously toward Karen's office before whispering that he had seen fees applied retroactively, charges backdated to make balances appear lower than they actually were. I asked him if he would be willing to help me, and his eyes darted to the security cameras. "Not here," he said. He scribbled a phone number on the back of my receipt and slipped it into my hand. That night, I called him from a payphone downtown. His name was Michael. He explained in a hushed voice that he had worked at the bank for 3 years and had seen managers manipulate accounts to cover shortfalls. When money went missing, they froze accounts under the excuse of suspicious activity, then quietly moved numbers around until the books balanced. Customers rarely noticed because by the time their accounts reopened, the records looked legitimate. My freeze was not about fraud committed by me. It was about fraud committed by them. The bank had used my account as a stopgap to cover losses. When I asked if he could prove it, Michael said he had copies of internal emails and spreadsheets saved on a flash drive. He sounded terrified even admitting it. If they found out he had those files, he could lose his job or worse. I promised to protect him, to keep his name out of anything, but I begged him to let me see the evidence. A week later, we met in the back of a quiet diner. He slid the flash drive across the table like it was contraband. On it were documents that made my stomach churn. Emails from Karen White discussing temporary reallocations of funds, spreadsheets showing customer balances being shifted like pieces on a chessboard, internal notes calling freezes standard cover procedure. My name appeared in several places, always flagged as non-compliant or pending fraud review. The perfect excuse to justify keeping my money out of reach while they covered their tracks. I stared at the screen in disbelief. They had used me as a pawn. When I looked up at Michael, he could not meet my eyes. "This happens more than you think," he said softly. "Customers assume it is a glitch or a routine security. They never realize their money is being moved to plug holes." I left the diner that night with the flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. For the first time since Spain, I felt a spark of power returning to me. They had tried to bury me, but now I held proof that could bury them instead. At home, I backed up the files in 3 different places. Then I called an old friend named Lisa, who worked as a paralegal for a property lawyer. When I told her what I had found, she asked me to come by her office the next morning. She read through the document slowly, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. "This is not just misconduct," she said finally. "This is fraud on a scale that could bring regulators down hard. But you need to be careful. If you move too soon, they will bury you in countersuits." She suggested I file a formal complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the State Banking Commission, but she also advised gathering more evidence first.
The bank had power, money, and lawyers. I needed a case so airtight they could not wriggle out of it. I spent the next several weeks tracking every fee and charge on my accounts over the past 5 years. Patterns emerged. The same security reviews had happened to dozens of customers in my town. Some of them were elderly, others small business owners, all of them vulnerable. I started knocking on doors. At first, people were reluctant to talk, embarrassed that they had been caught in the same trap. But when I showed them the documents Michael had given me, their hesitation melted into anger. A retired teacher told me she lost her savings when her account was frozen before a medical procedure. A shop owner said his payroll bounced during the holidays because the bank had locked him out. Each story added weight to mine, like stones in a sling. The bank had thought I was just one angry customer. In reality, I was becoming the voice of dozens who had been silenced. Late one night, I reread my grandfather's old journals, looking for comfort. He had always told me the truth was like water. You could dam it, divert it, try to hold it back, but eventually it found a way through. As I held the flash drive in my hand, I whispered to myself that I would be the one to break their dam wide open. What I did not realize then was that the bank already knew I was digging, and they were preparing their own counterstrike.
I knew the bank would not stop on its own, so I decided to set a trap that would force their hand. The first step was filing complaints. I submitted everything I had gathered to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the State Banking Commission. Every document Michael had given me was included, every statement with hidden fees highlighted, every testimony from neighbors carefully recorded. I thought it would take months for them to respond, but within 2 weeks I received confirmation letters that my case had been assigned for review. That was the first glimmer of hope, but it was not enough. The bank was powerful in my state and had friends in government. Regulators alone might not bring them down. I needed to build pressure from every angle. I met again with Lisa, the paralegal, and she connected me with a journalist she trusted. His name was Daniel, and he worked for a regional paper that often covered consumer rights. We met in a quiet corner of a library where I handed him copies of the files. He leafed through them carefully, his face hardening. "If what you are saying is true," he whispered, "this could be the biggest financial scandal our town has seen in years." He promised to investigate, but warned me it would take time to publish anything solid. That was fine. I was patient. What mattered now was that the bank did not know how much I had already gathered. I played my part carefully. I still visited the branch, pretending to be desperate and confused. Karen White grew more smug each time I begged her to release my funds. She thought she had won. She did not realize that every word she said to me, every threat disguised as policy, was being recorded on my phone. The flash drive from Michael was the foundation, but Karen's arrogance was the cement that held the case together. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox that nearly knocked the wind out of me. It was not an apology. It was a lawsuit. The bank was suing me for fraud. They claimed I had deposited funds tied to illegal transfers and had attempted to withdraw them overseas, triggering the freeze. Reading those accusations made my blood boil. Not only had they frozen my life and stolen my money, now they were trying to brand me a criminal in court. I called Lisa immediately. She told me this was a common tactic. If the bank painted me as fraudulent, then any evidence I presented would look like a cover-up. It was a preemptive strike to silence me. For a few hours, despair threatened to crush me. Fighting a bank in court was like fighting a giant with bare hands. They had lawyers on retainer, endless money to drag cases out, and connections to bend rules in their favor. But as I sat in the dim light of my apartment, staring at that lawsuit, something hardened inside me. If they wanted a fight in court, then that was where the truth would come out. The next morning, I hired Lisa's firm to represent me. Walter Briggs, an older attorney with sharp eyes, took the lead. He studied the lawsuit, then looked at me and said, "They think you are weak. They expect you to fold or settle. But if your documents are real, we can turn this around." I showed him everything, the flash drive, the statements, the recorded conversations. His eyes widened as he clicked through the files. "This is more than a defense," he said. "This is a counterattack." We filed our response swiftly, denying all allegations and submitting a motion to compel discovery of the bank's internal records. Walter warned me that the bank would resist and stall, but eventually the court would demand they open their books. While the legal wheels began to turn, I continued to gather allies. I spoke to more neighbors, more small business owners, anyone who had ever felt the sting of mysterious freezes or hidden fees. I collected their stories, like ammunition. Daniel, the journalist, kept in touch, hinting that his editors were preparing a feature story once enough evidence was verified. The walls around the bank were beginning to close, though they still did not realize it. Then one night, as I returned home, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It had tinted windows, and the engine idled quietly. The next morning, it was gone, but by evening, it was back again. For 3 nights in a row, the car appeared. I knew intimidation when I saw it. Someone wanted me to feel watched. Instead of fear, I felt confirmation. They knew I had something dangerous to them. I whispered to myself that the trap was ready. All I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. The lawsuit hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Until then, I would play my part as the struggling customer, the outsider with no power, while in reality, I held the knife behind my back. I smiled each time I imagined Karen White sitting in her glass office, certain that she had me cornered. She had no idea the stage was being set for her downfall. The morning of the hearing arrived heavy with gray skies that seemed to mirror the weight in my chest. I dressed in my only suit, the one I had not worn since my grandfather's funeral, and drove to the courthouse with Walter beside me. He was calm, sipping coffee from a thermos, while I sat rigid in the passenger seat, rehearsing every detail of my story in my head. When we walked into the courtroom, the bank's team was already there. 4 lawyers in dark suits sat behind a long, polished table. Their confidence was obvious in their posture. Karen White sat with them, her hair perfect, her lips curved into a smirk as if she already knew the outcome. They thought this was their domain, a place where ordinary people were crushed under the weight of procedure and paperwork. The judge entered, and everyone rose. My heart pounded in my ears. The bank's attorney spoke first, painting me as a reckless traveler who had attempted to withdraw suspicious funds abroad. He described me as irresponsible, careless with my accounts, and implied I had ties to fraudulent activity. Every word felt like a dagger, but I kept my face still. Walter had told me to let them dig their own hole. After nearly an hour of their accusations, the judge turned to Walter and asked for our response. Walter stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and began in a voice steady as stone. The narrative presented by the bank is not only misleading, Your Honor, it is deliberately false. He handed the judge a binder, and then another to the opposing counsel. Inside were copies of the original surveys of my account activity, unaltered and verified. Every so-called suspicious transaction was accounted for with receipts, travel documents, and confirmation emails. Walter spoke calmly but firmly, each piece of evidence erasing their claims one by one. The bank's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Karen's smirk faltered. Then Walter called me to the stand. My throat tightened as I swore the oath, but once I began speaking, the words poured out like a dam breaking. I described the moment my card was declined in Madrid, the humiliation of being stranded, the nights without food or shelter. I explained how I returned home to find bills unpaid, my family suffering, and my reputation smeared with the word fraud. I felt the judge's eyes on me, weighing every word. Then came the turning point. Walter asked if I had discovered anything unusual in the bank's handling of my account. I nodded and pulled a small folder from the table. Inside were printed copies of the emails Michael had given me, carefully redacted to protect his name. These documents show that my account was frozen not because of suspicious activity by me, but because funds were being shifted internally by the bank to cover shortfalls, I said. The courtroom went silent, except for the shuffle of papers. The judge leaned forward, reading the lines highlighted in yellow. Temporary reallocation, cover procedure, non-compliant account flagged for freeze. Karen's face drained of color. The lead bank attorney objected furiously, claiming the documents were stolen and inadmissible. Walter countered that they had been provided by an internal whistleblower concerned about fraud and that they directly pertained to the bank's claim against me. The judge allowed them into evidence. It was like watching a dam crack. The bank's confidence fractured in real time. Their arguments suddenly looked hollow. Walter pressed further, demanding discovery of all freeze procedures and internal audit records. The bank's attorneys scrambled, whispering among themselves, trying to object. The judge finally spoke in a stern voice. If these documents are genuine, then this case raises serious concerns not just for the defendant, but for every customer of this bank. He ordered the bank to produce their internal policies within 10 days. The final blow came when Walter questioned Karen directly. She was called to the stand reluctantly, her perfect posture stiff with anger. Under oath, she tried to maintain her composure, but Walter's questions cut like knives. "Mrs. White, have you ever used the term cover procedure in relation to account freezes?" She hesitated, glanced at her lawyers, then muttered, "Yes." "Have you ever instructed staff to hold accounts longer than necessary to adjust internal balances?" "Objection!" shouted the bank attorney, but the judge overruled. Karen stammered that it was standard practice to ensure accuracy. The judge's expression turned dark. Standard practice to deprive customers of their funds? The courtroom buzzed with whispers. In that moment, the trap snapped shut. The bank had walked directly into the case I had been building for months. They had painted me as a criminal, but now their own manager admitted to manipulating accounts. Walter rested his case with a simple statement. "Your Honor, this is not about one frozen account. This is about systemic abuse hidden under the guise of security." The judge dismissed us for the day, promising a ruling soon. As we packed our papers, Karen shot me a look of pure venom, but I no longer felt small under her gaze. For the first time since that morning in Madrid, I felt free. They had tried to freeze me out of my own life, but in that courtroom, it was their lies that had been locked in ice.
The ruling came 2 weeks later, though it felt like months. I barely slept in that time, pacing my apartment at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the judge would be swayed by the bank's lawyers despite everything we had presented. When the envelope finally arrived by certified mail, I tore it open at my kitchen table with trembling hands. The words blurred for a moment as I read, then sharpened like sunlight breaking through clouds. The court found in my favor. The bank was ordered to unfreeze my account immediately, return every penny of fees they had taken, pay damages for hardship, and submit to a regulatory investigation of their freeze practices. I sat back in my chair and laughed for the first time in months. The sound startled me. Relief washed over me so strong it felt like my body was finally unclenching after being wound too tight for too long. Walter called a few minutes later, his voice calm but satisfied. "Congratulations," he said. "We won more than I expected. They are going to face hell from regulators now." The next day, my account was restored, and for the first time since the nightmare began, I could see my balance in full. But the victory was bigger than just my own money. News spread quickly after the ruling. Daniel, the journalist, ran his story with the headline, "Local Bank Exposed for Systemic Account Freezes." The article detailed not only my case, but others I had connected with, people whose lives had been upended in similar ways. Their faces and voices filled the pages, each story a small wound that together painted a picture of widespread abuse. The article was picked up by larger outlets. Soon television crews were parking outside the branch. Customers poured in, demanding answers. The smug look Karen White once wore had vanished. She resigned within a week, citing personal reasons. But I knew the truth. She had been forced out, a scapegoat for a scandal that ran much deeper. Regulators descended on the bank like hawks. Investigators pored over records, interviewed employees, and subpoenaed executives. What they found confirmed what Michael had risked everything to reveal. The freeze policy was not an accident. It was a deliberate strategy used to manipulate liquidity and mask financial shortfalls. Customers had been treated as tools, their hardship written off as collateral damage. Fines followed, millions of dollars in penalties that shook the bank's foundation. Some executives faced charges, others scrambled to distance themselves. For ordinary people, the result was refunds. Letters began arriving at homes across town, checks enclosed to return stolen fees. Elderly couples who had lost savings found restitution. Small businesses received apologies and settlements. The damage could never be fully undone, but justice, at least, had been served. For me, the victory was bittersweet. I had fought so long and so hard that when it was over, I felt both triumphant and empty. I took a few days to breathe, to sit quietly in my apartment without fear of the phone ringing with another demand or threat. I visited my mother with my sister, bringing her flowers and assuring her that her care would never again be interrupted by the greed of a bank. One evening, I walked past the branch where it had all begun. The glass doors were locked, the lobby dark. A sign taped to the window announced, "New management coming soon." I stood there for a while, watching my reflection against the empty space inside, remembering the way Karen had once told me with a smirk that some inconvenience was to be expected. Now it was her who had been inconvenienced, her career left in ruins, her power stripped away. Justice had a way of balancing books more honestly than any bank ever could. Months later, I finally returned to Spain. This time when I checked into the hotel and handed over my card, it beeped with smooth approval. I smiled at the clerk, but inside I smiled even wider at the memory of how far I had come. I walked through the streets of Madrid with the weight gone from my shoulders, free to enjoy the trip as it was meant to be. I sat at a cafe with a cup of strong coffee, the same place where, months earlier, I had stood humiliated and helpless. Now, I was whole again. A young couple at the next table argued quietly about bank fees, frustrated with charges they did not understand. I leaned over and told them to always keep their records, to never trust the fine print. They looked surprised, then grateful. I realized then that my fight had not only been for me, but for everyone who had ever been frozen, silenced, or cornered by a system designed to protect itself at our expense. I thought about Michael, the teller who had risked his job to give me the flash drive. He had since left the bank, taking a job in another industry where he no longer had to hide behind secrets. We still spoke sometimes, and I always thanked him. Without his courage, none of this would have been possible. I thought about Walter, steady as stone in the courtroom, dismantling the lies with patience and precision. I thought about my grandfather's words that truth was like water, unstoppable in the end. He had been right. As I watched the sun set over Madrid, golden light spilling across rooftops, I whispered a quiet vow. If the banks ever tried again, if they ever thought they could freeze another person's life for their own gain, I would be ready. I had learned how to fight them, and I had learned that even giants can fall when ordinary people refuse to be silent. The bank froze my account, but in the end, it was their power that froze instead, locked in place for the world to see, while I walked away free.